At this hour, on this day, 40 years ago, British, American, Canadian and Allied troops were fighting to consolidate their gains on and around the beaches of Normandy. They had landed by air and sea, overnight and during the day. Their purpose, to liberate Europe. Today, veterans of that campaign returned to those beaches to remember their fallen comrades. They were joined by the Queen, President Reagan, other monarchs and other leaders. D-Day marked the end of a chapter of preparation and the start of a chapter of struggle. The news that that page had been turned was announced to the world by the BBC. 40 years later, the man who made that announcement, John Snagge, remembers it vividly.
I was advised some 10 days before it actually took place that I was the person who was to do the announcement. The call I'd been waiting for night after night came on the telephone, report to Chief Headquarters, and that was about 3 o'clock in the morning. I went into a little studio at Chief Headquarters. The next thing that happened was that an American police chap came into the office and smacked down in front of me a pink card, which was in fact the announcement of the invasion.
This is London. London calling in the home, overseas and European services of the BBC and through United Nations Radio Mediterranean. And this is John Snagge speaking. Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, have just issued communique number 1, and in a few seconds I will read it to you. Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France.
The British forces, with their allies, took with them the prayers of their king.
We and our allies are sure that our fight is against evil and for a world in which goodness and honor may be the foundation of the life of men in every land.
As the day progressed, the BBC's war reporters sent home their accounts of the conflict.
With grinding brakes and creaking timbers, we jolted, lurched, and were landing in northern France early this morning. The glider in which I travelled came off better than most. Some had buried their noses in the soil. Others had lost a wheel or a wing. One had crashed into a house. 2 had crashed into each other.
This is the day and this is the hour. The sky is lightening. Lightening over the coast of Europe as we go in. All around this enormous circle, there are ships standing to and firing. You can't imagine anything like this march of ships, like soldiers marching in line.
The British, Canadian and American troops who landed on the coast of France, north of the lovely town of Caen, in broad daylight this morning, are already several miles inland, on a front sufficiently broad to be more than a bridgehead. I feel I should repeat that there may be a change on the way, but at any rate, it is proper to report that the first phase of the attack on Western Europe has gone not only according to plan, but corking well.
The voices of D-Day. And today, those moments have been remembered by many who lived through them and by the families of those who did not. Over to Normandy and Philip Short.
Some 30,000 of the men who fought on the beaches and the battlefields of Normandy are here today to commemorate the operation which their Supreme Commander, General Eisenhower, called the Great Crusade, this noble undertaking. For the ceremonies of remembrance, the veterans were joined by the Queen and Prince Philip, King Olaf of Norway, Queen Beatrix of the Netherlands, Belgium's King Baudouin, President Reagan, President Mitterrand, and the Canadian Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau. One of the most moving ceremonies was at the Commonwealth War Cemetery here in Bayeux. Geoffrey Wareham was there to see it.
Like the 5,000 veterans who came to honor their fallen comrades, the blossoming horse chestnut trees, saplings 40 years ago, have reached maturity to become a dominating feature of the cemetery. The men who stormed into Normandy, wearied now by age, stood in silence with the Queen, Prince Philip, President Mitterrand and his wife to remember the sacrifice of more than 4,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers who are buried here. Their thoughts were put into words by Archdeacon W.F. Johnston, Chaplain General to the Land Forces.
Those whom we knew and whose memory we cherish, and all who, not counting the cost, have preserved for us the precious heritage of freedom. We give thanks for their courage, their devotion to duty, and their comradeship. And we continue to pray that we may walk worthy of their sacrifice.
After a minute's silence, the Queen and President Mitterrand placed wreaths of red roses at the cross of sacrifice, the Queen bowing in tribute. The President then left the cemetery, and the Queen and Prince Philip spoke to many of the veterans, some of them disabled by wounds inflicted during the invasion. The royal party was accompanied by 4 distinguished senior officers who played important roles in the Overlord operation. The Queen and Prince Philip then walked among the graves, pausing at that of the only VC in the cemetery, Corporal S. Bates of the Royal Norfolk Regiment. He was killed on August the 8th, 1944, aged 23.
While the Queen was at Bayeux, President Reagan was visiting Omaha Beach in the western sector of the invasion area where American forces came ashore. He went first to the Pointe du Hoc, a rocky promontory from which heavily defended German gun emplacements were pinning down U.S. assault troops all along the coast to Utah, 10 miles away. U.S. Rangers knocked out the German guns after scaling an almost sheer 100-foot-high cliff using rocket-propelled grappling irons in the face of withering machine gun fire. Of 225 Rangers, only 90 lived to fight again. Clive Small watched the President's arrival.
The music and the memories of the battle for Pointe du Hoc were first an American occasion. The President spoke to veterans of D-Day gathered on this isolated little promontory on the Normandy coast. They were the survivors of the 2nd Ranger Battalion, men who'd scaled the cliffs to take the German gun batteries and suffered heavily in one of the famous actions of the Second World War. Mr. Reagan's words recreated that moment, a masterfully crafted speech full of the patriotic feeling that the President evoked so well. But it was generous, too, in recognizing the feats of courage of other Allied forces. 40 years ago, General Eisenhower was calling the Russians our brave allies. Today, Mr. Reagan spoke not only of what the Soviet Union once suffered, but of the threat she now posed. But he again stressed, as he's doing regularly in this election year, that he seeks an accommodation with Moscow.
I tell you from my heart that we in the United States do not want war. We want to wipe from the face of the earth the terrible weapons that man now has in his hands. And I tell you, we're ready to seize that beachhead. We look for some sign from the Soviet Union that they are willing to move forward, that they share our desire and love for peace, and that they will give up the ways of conquest. There must be a changing there that will allow us to turn our hope into action.
Mr. Reagan went next to Omaha Beach, the scene of another desperate action. And from there, he joined the leaders of the other Allied powers in their salute to the greatest amphibious assault in history.
President Reagan, the Queen, Monsieur Mitterrand and the other leaders then made their separate ways to Utah Beach for the main ceremony of the day, as Martin Sixsmith reports.
Utah Beach, thousands of square yards of flat, barren sands, bordered on one side by the sea and on the other by marshland. The invaders wouldn't have landed here at all, except that a strong sea current swept them 2 miles south of their original target. Today's ceremonies began with the impressive sight of infantry contingents on the beach, representing the 7 nationalities which contributed to the main D-Day forces. At sea, 7 warships, including HMS Fife, fired a 21-gun salute. and President Mitterrand, arriving by helicopter, welcomed the 7 heads of state and government, including the Queen and President Reagan, pausing beside the symbolic milestone marked with the figure 0 to indicate the starting point of the Allies' long march to liberate Western Europe. In a short speech to close the ceremony, President Mitterrand paid homage to the Russian war effort in the East, but he said it was the troops who passed through these Normandy beachheads who were to decide the fate of the war, of Europe, and of the world.
After leaving Utah Beach, the Queen is now on her way to Arromanches, a small seaside village 20 miles to the east, where in the days immediately after the landings, British engineers built the world's biggest artificial harbour, which became the main supply point for the entire invasion force. But first, she travelled with the Canadian Prime Minister, Mr. Trudeau, to Canada's National Cemetery at Benny-sur-Mer, where 2,000 Canadian soldiers are buried. Many of them died in a battle against a German panzer division. One of those who took part in that engagement was David Fletcher of the Queen's Own Rifles. Patrick Brown asked him for his thoughts on coming back.
You never forget your first battle, because it has an awful... leaves an awful impression on you. It just one of those things that you never forget.
Is it the first time you've been back since 1944?
The first time. And the bad memories come back.
What particularly?
Chaps I left here. They will never come back. Quite a few of them. Just up from the church.
Yeah.
Some on the beaches. But that is the war. Some live, some die.
Many of the veterans who've come here are wearing the insignia of ex-servicemen's associations. A few are in their original wartime uniforms, carefully conserved with a row of campaign medals. As well as the big official ceremonies, there have been private memorial services at individual beaches all along the coast, commemorating the exploits of the men who fought and triumphed there. Ken Phillott from Wickford in Essex described how, as a 25-year-old commando, he came ashore at Colville.
It reminded me of Dante's Inferno, accompanied by sound effects. We had all the big ships out here, the battleships firing overhead. There were 1 or 2 tanks landing at that particular time. The Germans were firing from this side, especially with mortar bombs. They were pitching all the way around. And one not only got the sound and the sight, but you got the smell of burning oil and cordite. That stands firmly in my mind. But the thing that I remember more than anything else was the inability to get from the water to this escarpment up here. When one realizes one was wading ashore in this water, and with this soft sand, it felt that every step you took, you slid back too.
But they did get through, and the people of Normandy greeted them as liberators. Philippe de Bourgoin, in a village just above Arromanches, remembers going out the morning after the bombardment and catching his breath at what he saw.
From the top of the little wall, I had the view on the sea. And that remains the view of my life. And the sea was full of ships, big ones, small ones, and nearly no more sea. That was 7 o'clock in the morning on 6th of June. And seeing what was in front of us, we realized that it could not be a success with the forces that were in front. You see, when I arrived on the top of the cliff and I saw the sea full of ships, and that has been and will be the sight of my life.
That report from Normandy was by Philip Short. It's not only former soldiers from the Allied forces who remember the Normandy landings. Former German servicemen have also been recalling their role. And as our Bonn correspondent David Smeeton reports, the people of West Germany have been reflecting on the events of 40 years ago and today's commemorations.
It's only in recent days that a series of newspaper articles has reminded the West Germans of the anniversary. The mood is muted, the memories are painful. The longest day has been screened on television, and veterans have recounted how they survived the Allied onslaught. Among them, the first man to spot the invasion force, former Flight Lieutenant Adalbert Beowulf from his Messerschmitt 109 reconnaissance plane.
We scrambled about 6 o'clock in the morning from an airfield near the French town of Laval. And the first action I noticed were crashed gliders. we made a left turn northwest of the mouth of the Orne and into the haze. It was very hazy that morning, and suddenly, a few miles off the coast, there was the fleet, about 40 or 50 ships there sitting, coming out of the haze, landing ships, minesweepers, all kinds of ships.
The feelings are somber, a reminder that 40 years on, the legacy of Hitler persists. There's also frustration, regret, that as West Germany tries to look forward and play a full democratic role in the present Western alliance, the Normandy ceremonies seem backward-looking and carry the danger of making today's Germans feel alienated, vanquished, and guilty. They would prefer, in looking forward, to commemorate the thousands who died on both sides. They'd like memories to grow shorter, but inevitably they know that the interest on the mortgage of Hitler may remain payable for some years to come.